The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, casting long shadows over the rows of neatly trimmed lawns and identical houses. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. The Homeowners Association, HOA, ruled with an iron fist, ensuring that every hedge was trimmed, every mailbox was painted the same shade of white, and no one dared to park their RV in the driveway for more than 24 hours. But beneath the surface of this idyllic community, a storm was brewing, one that would shake Willow Creek to its core. At the heart of the storm was a modest, unassuming house at the end of Maple Lane. It belonged to Colonel James "Jim" Calloway, a decorated U.S. Army officer who had recently returned from his latest deployment. Jim was a quiet man, the kind who kept to himself and rarely attended the HOA meetings. He had inherited the house from his late parents, and it was the only place he had ever truly called home. But Jim wasn't just any soldier. He was a highly respected general in the U.S. Army, though he never flaunted his rank. To his neighbors, he was just Jim, the guy who mowed his lawn every Saturday and waved politely from his porch. Unbeknownst to Jim, the HOA had big plans for Willow Creek. They had been quietly working on a new project, a state-of-the-art community center with a swimming pool, tennis courts, and a clubhouse. The only problem was that Jim's house sat right in the middle of the proposed construction site. The HOA had tried to reach him multiple times, sending letters and emails, but Jim had been overseas and the correspondence had gone unanswered. Frustrated and eager to move forward, the HOA board made a fateful decision. They would proceed with the project and bulldoze the house, assuming that Jim had abandoned it. The morning of the demolition, the HOA board gathered at the site, along with a small crowd of curious neighbors. The bulldozer roared to life, its metal jaws glinting in the sunlight. No one noticed the black SUV speeding down Maple Lane until it screeched to a halt in front of the house. Out stepped Jim, still in his army fatigues, his face a mask of disbelief as he took in the scene. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. The bulldozer operator hesitated, glancing at the HOA president, a stern woman named Margaret Hargrove. Margaret stepped forward, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. "Mr. Calloway, we've been trying to reach you for months. This property is slated for demolition to make way for the new community center. You should have received our notices." Jim's eyes narrowed. "I've been serving my country overseas, ma'am. I didn't receive any notices. And even if I had, you can't just tear down a man's home without his consent." Margaret sighed, clearly annoyed. "I'm afraid we can. The HOA bylaws give us the authority to take action on properties that are deemed abandoned or in violation of community standards. Your house falls into both categories." Jim's jaw tightened. He had faced down enemy forces in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. But this was something else entirely. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he said quietly, his voice laced with menace. Margaret rolled her eyes. "Mr. Calloway, this is not a war zone. This is Willow Creek. We have rules, and everyone has to follow them." Before Jim could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and answered it with a curt, "Calloway." The voice on the other end was urgent, and Jim's expression darkened as he listened. He hung up and turned back to Margaret. "You have 1 hour to clear this site and call off the demolition," he said. "If you don't, you'll regret it." Margaret laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Or what, Mr. Calloway? Are you going to call the police?" Jim didn't answer. Instead, he walked back to his SUV and drove off, leaving the crowd murmuring in confusion. Exactly 1 hour later, the sound of helicopters filled the air. 3 Black Hawks descended on Willow Creek, landing in the open field next to the community park. Out poured a squad of soldiers, their uniforms crisp, their weapons at the ready. Leading them was Jim, now dressed in his full general's uniform, his medals gleaming in the sunlight. The crowd gasped as the soldiers formed a perimeter around Jim's house, effectively halting the demolition. Margaret stormed forward, her face red with anger. "What is the meaning of this? You can't just bring the military into our neighborhood." Jim stepped forward, his presence commanding. "This is my home, Ms. Hargrove. And as a general in the United States Army, I have the authority to protect it. You, on the other hand, have overstepped your bounds. You didn't just try to destroy my property. You violated my rights as a citizen and a service member." Margaret sputtered, but before she could respond, a man in a suit stepped forward. He was flanked by 2 lawyers, and he introduced himself as the HOA's legal counsel. "General Calloway, while we respect your service, this is a civil matter. The HOA acted within its rights, and we have the paperwork to prove it." Jim smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "Do you now? Because I have a team of JAG officers who would beg to differ. And let's not forget the media. Imagine the headlines. HOA bulldozes war heroes home. How do you think it will play out?" The lawyer paled, but Margaret wasn't ready to back down. "This is ridiculous. You can't just bully us into submission." Jim's smile faded. "This isn't bullying, Miss Hargrove. This is justice. And if you don't stand down, I'll make sure everyone in this country knows what you've done." In the end, the HOA had no choice but to back down. The demolition was called off, and Jim's house was spared, standing as a defiant symbol of resilience against the overreach of authority. But the fallout was far from over. News of the incident spread like wildfire, fueled by sensational headlines and viral social media posts. "HOA bulldozes war heroes home," screamed one news outlet, while another declared, "General stand against HOA tyranny inspires nation." Within days, Willow Creek was thrust into the national spotlight, becoming a flashpoint for debates about property rights, the power of HOAs, and the treatment of military veterans. Reporters descended on the quiet neighborhood, interviewing neighbors, digging into the HOA's history, and painting a picture of a community divided. The HOA, once a seemingly untouchable entity, found itself under intense scrutiny. The legal ramifications were swift and severe. The HOA was inundated with lawsuits, not just from Jim, but from a growing number of homeowners who had long been dissatisfied with the board's heavy-handed tactics. Stories emerged of families fined for minor infractions, of elderly residents harassed over trivial violations, and of a culture of fear and intimidation that had festered under Margaret Hargrove's leadership. Jim's case became the catalyst for a wave of accountability, as homeowners banded together to demand change. The lawsuits piled up, and the HOA's legal fees skyrocketed, draining its reserves and forcing it to reconsider its approach. Margaret Hargrove, once the unyielding face of the HOA, resigned in disgrace, her reputation in tatters. The rest of the board followed suit, their positions untenable in the face of overwhelming public backlash. As for Jim, he became something of a local hero, a symbol of standing up to injustice. His story resonated far beyond Willow Creek, inspiring veterans and civilians alike. He used his newfound influence to push for sweeping reforms within the HOA, working with the new board to draft bylaws that prioritized fairness and transparency. Gone were the days of arbitrary fines and unchecked power. In their place was a system designed to serve the community, not control it. Jim's leadership extended beyond the HOA, as he became an advocate for military families facing similar struggles. He testified before state legislatures, pushing for laws to protect service members from losing their homes while deployed. His efforts earned him accolades and recognition, but Jim remained humble, focused on the mission at hand. Though he could have moved away, leaving the drama of Willow Creek behind, Jim chose to stay. The house on Maple Lane was more than just a structure to him. It was a connection to his past, a place filled with memories of his parents and the life they had built together. It was his sanctuary, a reminder of why he fought so hard to protect what mattered most. And so, he stayed, rebuilding not just his home, but the community around it. Neighbors who had once been strangers now greeted him with warmth and gratitude, their respect for him evident in every handshake and smile. The new community center, once a source of contention, was eventually built, but not on Maple Lane. Instead, it was constructed on the other side of the neighborhood, far from Jim's house, on a plot of land donated by a local business owner who had been inspired by Jim's story. The center became a symbol of unity, a place where families could gather, children could play, and the community could heal. At its dedication ceremony, Jim was invited to cut the ribbon, a gesture of goodwill from the new HOA board and a recognition of his role in shaping the neighborhood's future. As he stood there, scissors in hand, Jim couldn't help but smile. The crowd cheered, cameras flashed, and the weight of the past few months seemed to lift from his shoulders. He had faced down enemies on a battlefield and won, but this victory, this one was personal. It was a victory not just for him, but for every homeowner who had ever felt powerless against an unjust system. It was a victory for his parents, who had worked so hard to build a life in Willow Creek. And it was a victory for the community, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, change was possible. As the ribbon fell and the crowd erupted in applause, Jim felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The fight was over, but the legacy of his stand would endure, a testament to the power of courage, integrity, and the unyielding belief that home was worth fighting for. And as he looked out at the faces of his neighbors, his friends, he knew that Willow Creek was no longer just a place on a map. It was home, and it was sweet.